be digitalization in a multi-level governance context, the case of cohesion policy. Okay, so thank you again very much for your kind acceptance of this invitation, and I'm passing the floor to Luis. Luis Colnot is a researcher and consultant in the Development and Evaluation Unit of the Center for Industrial Studies, based in Milan, Italy. He has specialized in regional and local economic development, especially cohesion policy, as well as in research, development, and innovation issues. He has also been involved in several policy-oriented research and consultancy projects for different institutions, including the European Commission and the European Parliament. Also with us is Dr. Julie Pellegrin. She is a senior consultant in Development and Evaluation Unit, also at the Center for Industrial Studies. She has a long-standing experience in public policy analysis and evaluation, as well as in policy and technical advisory in the fields of local and regional development, cohesion policy and public policy delivery mechanisms and governance. Julie has been having research and teaching experience in various European universities, namely in Italy, France, the Netherlands, and in the United Kingdom. Okay, and we hope also to have her with us at the University of Aveiro in the near future. Okay, so thank you again, and I think that Louis will start the presentation, and then we'll pass the floor to Julie. So Louise, whenever you want, you can start. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Well, thank you for your words. So good morning. My name is Louis Colnot, as explained. I will try to share my presentation, which should work. Can you all see if it's working?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you very much. So, unfortunately, as you all know, we're not able to be physically present with you today in Portugal for this conference, but I will start by mentioning and introducing our topic by making a reference to a very local project, actually, which is the Aveiro Steam City project, which I'm sure many of you know much better than I do. But basically, it includes very different elements, including support to digital skills, use of ICT for creativity, the rollout of an experimental 5G network as a test bed for different stakeholders, including companies, to test applications in various fields, such as transportation, health, sports, and so on and so forth. And an interesting point of this particular project for our presentation is that it has benefited from funding of the European Union through a policy called cohesion policy. And it's an example among many other type of projects that have benefited from this type of support in recent years. And basically, the interesting point of cohesion policy is that it has specific characteristics, including a focus on regions and a reliance on multi-level governance, meaning that it tries to involve stakeholders at different levels, including, for instance, nation state, but also cities, regions, stakeholder on the ground of different types. And we think that these specific characteristics of cohesion policy may be interesting for digitalization. So basically, the case of cohesion policy is almost a good excuse to reflect on the potential benefits of such an approach focused on regions and multi-level governance. And it is what basically we would like to discuss with you today. To do that, we would like to mention both theoretical and empirical aspects. So theoretical benefits of basically what we think might be relevant and useful from this type of approach for digitalization, but also first element of answer of actually what's going on the ground and what we can bring as hard evidence on that, whether these theoretical benefits materialize or not, under which conditions, and so on and so forth. Of course, we will not claim to reach definitive and general conclusions based on our presentation today, but it will bring many examples and elements to feed the discussion and to initiate a reflection on these kind of issues. During the presentation, we will rely on different sources of evidence, including the existing literature, but also on different projects we've been involved in with Julie at CSIL. And in particular, we will use a project that we've conducted for the European Parliament a few years ago in 2018, which was called Digital Agenda and Cohesion Policy. The project was a little bit broader than our conversation today, but the full report is available online on the website of the European Parliament. So if you're interested in the topic in general, I would definitely recommend taking a look at it and read it further. So to tell you how this presentation will be organized, it will have basically 3 parts. In the third part, I will basically outline some key definitions and concepts to make sure that we are all on the same page in terms of notions and what we'll be discussing with you today. And I will give you some contextual elements regarding cohesion policy in general and its approach towards digitalization. Then in the second part, I will outline some theoretical benefits of cohesion policy for digitalization that we have identified that can be derived basically from the focus on regions and the use of multi-level governance approach. And I will also mention some mechanisms and some organizational elements of cohesion policy that we think may be able to secure these benefits in practice. But of course, at this point, it will only be a reflection and logical deduction, basically. And in the last part, Julie will tell you about the empirical evidence that we obtained for cohesion policy and its potential for digitalization, trying to bridge the theoretical part with the empirical one. And we will notably use different examples from case studies from different member states to try to have quite a broad picture of the conditions for success and also the areas where things are less certain. And for this presentation, we will focus on the most recent period of cohesion policy, which is 2014 to 2020. And after that, of course, we move to general conclusions and to the answers, questions and answer sessions. So to give you some basic elements on what we mean during this presentation, what will we try to discuss. First, I don't know to what extent all of you are familiar with cohesion policy in general, but it's to be very, very broad. It's an important EU policy. It's actually one of the largest items of the EU budget. And it's a policy with the aim of reducing territorial disparities between the different places in Europe by focusing on the less developed regions as proxied by GDP per capita. So the idea is to channel funding towards these regions so they can basically catch up with the other EU regions. Another important specificity of this policy is its multi-level governance approach that I've mentioned earlier, meaning that unlike many EU policies that are managed centrally by the European Commission organizing and implementing the policy, this particular cohesion policy involves stakeholders at the national level, at the regional level, and also stakeholders on the ground trying to design and implement the policy together. So it's quite unique among EU policies to have this level of multi-level governance. Regarding digitalization, so there are many possible definitions of digitalization, as you may know, but in this context, it will be basically the process of diffusion of information and communication technologies and their uses, which has obviously some critical social and economic effects, especially benefits such as promoting economic development, ensuring a better access to public services, building new skills, and so on and so forth. Of course, these benefits are also accompanied by some risks that should be taken into consideration. So there are risks that are quite specific to ICT, for instance, linked to cybersecurity or privacy issues. But there are also risks that are more general, but should still be addressed when talking about digitalization. For instance, if not done properly, digitalization may actually exacerbate some territorial inequalities or other types of inequalities. For instance, regarding access of elderly to service. So regarding digitalization and cohesion policy, I would like to begin with a small historical background to give you a point about what the evolution has been in the past. An important characteristic of cohesion policy is that it has provided a support for digitalization at quite an early stage. We can track down the first initiatives linked to digitalization in cohesion policy to the late 80s. And of course, there is a process of consolidation for the different years. And another specificity is that cohesion policy has also long had what we call a holistic approach toward digitalization, meaning that it's not restricted to solely technological aspects, such as building infrastructures, providing support for research and development in specific technologies, but it has also tried to address these social aspects from quite an early stage, actually. So I will give you a little bit more detail in the next figure, which is extracted from the report for the European Parliament I mentioned earlier. So as you can see, the first spending linked to digitalization within cohesion policy dates back to the 80s, to the late 80s. And it was quite small amount at this stage, obviously. And we can notice that across the different programming period, because cohesion policy is organized in 7-year period, we can note an increase of funding towards digitalization, leading to the current period where there are about 20 billion euros dedicated to this aspect. Of course, during this time period, there has been an increase of the total EU budget. There has been new member states joining the union, so it makes sense that the budget is increasing. But it has also increased on a per capita basis in the long run. You can also see that there are some elements that are brought by each period. So I will not give you all the detail, but the holistic approach I've mentioned on before, we can track it down to the early 2000s, basically when the EU introduced the concept of information society, which is a way to consider not only, as I mentioned, technological aspects, but also to try to fit the citizen into this entire story of digitalization and to reflect on what it can achieve for the greater social purpose. So, and this attention towards a holistic approach has been consolidated for years. And in particular, since 2015, there has been a EU-wide strategy called Digital Agenda, which has been organizing digitalization in the EU in general, with some influences on cohesion policy. As you can see on this figure, Digital Agenda is quite a broad umbrella covering multiple dimensions, which shows this holistic dimension. You can see that it's covering very technological aspects, such as broadband development, such as the rollout of optical fiber, for instance, but also more generic framework conditions, such as ensuring that the standards for ICT are set appropriately, or that trust and security are built for the use of digital technologies. And it goes down to further applications, such as making sure that skills and inclusion are also part of the play, basically to make sure that people receive the right skills to be able to reap up the benefits and are not people left behind by this process of digitalization. And also the different application in terms of, for instance, securing what is called a digital single market, with elements such as e-commerce, electronic payment, and so on and so forth. So basically, cohesion policy today fits into this general picture of attention towards the multiple dimensions of digitalization. And to have a more specific comment on what is done concretely by cohesion policy, we can look at the current budget for 2014 to 2020. So as you can see on this figure, there is quite an important variety of investments regarding digitalization that are funded by cohesion policy. This figure is about planned spending. So you can see that there are very different things covered. Broadband and digital networks are basically about ICT infrastructures, and it's covering about 28% of the total digital investments through cohesion policy. But there are also different categories that can be regrouped. For instance, in e-government, digital skills and inclusions, it covers about 40% of the total spending for digitalization through cohesion policy. And we can also note that there are some emerging types of digital investments. For instance, smart cities and smart grids were quite unheard in the past. And with this current period of cohesion policy, there has been quite some significant funding dedicated to these issues, with about 20% of total funding for that type of issues. Of course, this is the overall picture, and there are differences between territories, as you may expect from a policy focused on regional development, which is why I wanted to show you a few maps. So on these maps, you can see two things. So on the one on the left, which is in shades of red, you can see funding per capita dedicated to digitalization through cohesion policy. So basically, as I've mentioned earlier, the goal of cohesion policy is to focus on less developed regions to make them catch up with the more developed regions of Europe. So this general logic of the policy is also present when we look only at digital aspects. As you can see on the left map, the regions from Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe receive the most funding for digitalization. But there is also the dimension of choice of what the different regions choose to use the cohesion policy funding for. And this is a map on the right, which is the in purple, which shows the share of cohesion policy dedicated to each region that is attributed to digital investments. So on this map, you can see a little bit different picture, right? Because you can see that some regions, including in western parts of Europe or northern parts of Europe, chooses to dedicate a relatively high share of cohesion policy for digitalization. As you can see, there are some regions in France or in Sweden that allocates a particularly high amount of funding towards digitalization. But we can also see that it's the case in many regions in Southern Europe and Central Europe, for instance, in southern Italy and in parts of Spain.
Louis, I'm
yeah.
sorry to interrupt you, but we are facing a small problem with the Zoom connection.
Okay, so a regionalized and multi-level governance approach, such as one that is adopted in cohesion policy, may be a way to address these differences that we spot at very different levels, basically. Potential related benefits is that this type of approach may be useful to adapt to local contexts and conditions. In particular, if you want to pinpoint some areas where progress should be pursued, or at least where the local stakeholders think we should push in this particular direction. And this kind of approach may be very relevant for this kind of benefits. A more technical aspect may be to bridge bottom-up and top-down digitalization initiatives. So to explain that, we've seen that digitalization, of course, encapsulates a huge variety of different things, but there are basically some perspectives, some initiatives that are very relevant at the top-down level. For instance, setting standards for interoperability, for privacy, and so on and so forth. it's something that is quite relevant to do at a broad level, for instance, at the EU level or at the national level. And you also have digitalization initiatives that should rely much more on local needs. For instance, if you have an issue of low uptake of services, it's maybe relevant to do like initiatives to boost the skills of the population to be able to reap out the benefits. And it's more like a bottom-up approach. And the idea of this argument is that the regions are basically in between of these two levels. And if they set the right strategy, they can try to make them join in a coherent way. So it's one of the potential benefits of such a regional approach. Another notable element is that it may be a way to address market failure that may occur for different reasons. For instance, we see that in less developed regions, the private sector may be unwilling to invest, for instance, in ICT infrastructure, in setting optical fiber, for instance, because they may expect that to not have sufficient return. So in this case, having a public investment at the regional level may be interesting to reap these benefits. And last but not least, this approach focusing on the different stakeholders at different level may be a way in itself to kickstart some local development and project initiatives. Now I would like to mention, to give you more detail on the framework of cohesion policy and how it might help to secure the benefits, the theoretical benefits I've mentioned earlier. So cohesion policy is basically organized through legal rules, regulations set at the EU level, and it's also containing some initiatives and some mechanisms that are less, how should I say, less set in stone, more informal. For instance, you have networks of practitioners trying to help to implement and design the policy. You have guidance documents produced by the European institutions to help to materialize this policy. And looking at the current programming period, that is to say the 2014 to 2020 period, we have noted that there are some mechanisms, some initiatives that we think might be able to help to secure these benefits of a regionalized and multi-level governance approach for digitalization. And I would like to mention a few with you. So first of all, there is an obligation of thematic concentration of funding, meaning that the regions should select investments in a relatively small series of objectives in order to have a relevant impact. And so you have a list basically of different thematic objectives, and one of them is dedicated to ICT. So obviously it may help to make the benefit materialize. More specifically, we can also note that for 2014 to 2020, there has been what is called ex-ante conditionalities, which is basically a way to ensure that specific regions have pre-existing conditions, have done some work to make sure that the investments end up in something relevant on the ground. So in particular, it means, for instance, designing strategic documents, taking a look at different aspects of an issue before making investments. And for the 2014 to 2020 period, there has been some ex-ante conditionalities dedicated to ICT. One which is called the digital growth strategy, which is quite holistic as well, in encapsulating the different potential benefits of digitalization. And another ex-ante conditionality is the next generation network plan. So this one is specifically for regions that want to have ICT infrastructure projects. So basically the idea of this conditionality is to have documents to make sure that the technical details are mastered by the regions prior to investments, to make sure that they can exploit the benefits that you mentioned earlier. There are also a series of simplification measures, and most importantly, as we think, there are some initiatives and mechanisms that favor partnership and territorial-based approach. So in particular, what is called the smart specialization strategies, which is basically a way for research development and innovation investments to consider the existing strength of a region. And it's taking place through a process called the entrepreneurial discovery process, which is basically a way to involve all the different stakeholders of the region to make them discuss at the same table to reach priorities that are relevant for the situation of the region and what they may like to do in the future. And this has applications for ICT as well. And you also have other initiatives such as integrated territorial investments, which focus on specific areas such as cities, and trying to involve stakeholders at a much smaller level to make sure that their needs are taken into consideration. And this may be extremely relevant to address, for instance, the territorial disparities within regions for digitalization that I mentioned earlier. And last but not least, you have all the more informal aspects of the policies, such as networks of practitioners, exchanges of good practices through label that may help to diffuse good digital initiatives across the different regions of Europe, give idea to the different stakeholders, and so on and so forth. So now I would like to leave the floor to Julie, which will give you some empirical evidence on how these actual potential benefits may materialize in Europe through cohesion policy.
All right, thank you very much, Louis. What I would like to do in this part, in the second part, shorter part of the presentation, is to unveil what dynamic on the ground we observed in the regions, what is going on beyond these aggregated data that Louis illustrated. Concretely, how regions have used the policy framework that we described. So for this, we used evidence from a set of case studies that we selected to represent different types of regions and different types of projects. You see them in this map. I will briefly describe them because they are interesting to show what cohesion policy is able to do in the field. We studied a cross-border project in the area of R&D, research and development applied in the area of climate change. That was across the border between Denmark and Sweden. It was called Smart City Accelerator. It brought together a large number of stakeholders, and it was interesting for this reason, 11 exactly, bringing together urban authorities, universities, companies, all working on innovative ICT solutions to promote energy optimization and a shift toward renewables. We also studied in France an e-inclusion project called La Fabrique Numérique. It was in the region Île-de-France. That was a small-scale ICT workshop, which objective was to tackle early school leave. We also studied in Lithuania an e-government aiming at establishing a social protection information system. That's an e-government project setting up a complex database, collecting and exchanging relevant data on social service to the benefits of users. There was also an infrastructure, a broadband network studied in Poland, where a lot of this type of investment are going on. That was in the region Podkarpackie. And interesting small project in rural areas to show that ICT is also promoted in this context, which is usually less receptive of ICT investment. That was a digital system to manage irrigation studied in an Italian region, Emilia-Romagna. And finally, a small project in Murcia, in Spain, consisting of an innovation voucher for SMEs to buy technological services. So this was just to show what Louis explained in theoretical terms. Cohesion policy can cover a large, wide range of topics and issues to adapt to local needs and to sustain a holistic approach. These different projects have also very different ranges of funding, from more than 15 billion euros in the case of the Polish infrastructure project to something like 100,000 euros in the French and Italian projects. Sorry, Louis, I forgot to ask you to yes. Okay, that was the corresponding slides. Now you can switch to the next one. Thanks very much. Sorry about that. Okay, so based on the evidence from the case studies that I just illustrated, I withdrew some lessons concerning the contribution of cohesion policy to help digitalization at regional level. One first news is that the policy and its regulatory provisions foster the development and the diffusion of good practices, sometimes innovative ones. That was illustrated by the Spanish voucher schemes, which was a test actually, and which was successfully developed and was implemented in other European contexts as a result. Second, and most importantly, we identified two main success factors underlying an effective digital investment strategy at regional level. On the one hand, it was clear that a good strategic planning is necessary to effectively implement a holistic approach, bringing together supply and demand for ICT. This makes possible to adopt a balanced approach covering the different dimensions of the holistic approach that Louis described, combining different types of measures and taking care of both the supply and the offer, the supply and the demand for ICT, ensuring that one is adapted to the other. In this respect, the ex-ante conditionality that Louis described, which demands that a strategy be in place to receive funding, is an important factor. It plays an important role, but per se, it is insufficient. And in this respect, administrative capacity of the regional authorities are extremely important factor. The other important conditions to implement the successful ICT investment at regional level is the development of partnerships between stakeholders. And this is actually one of the great value added of cohesion policy. And since this is a central issue addressed by the conference, I will go a little bit into depth concerning these aspects. Please, Louis, if you can change slide, thank you. So partnerships between stakeholders make possible to identify technologies that are adapted to local needs through, I would say, the mobilization of collective intelligence. This was a lesson of the voucher, the ICT voucher in Spain, for example, where it made possible to identify the technologies that were effectively needed by the company by bringing them together with the help of intermediary with ICT providers. It was also a lesson from the Polish case study, which show how broadband was an effective investment, but it was necessary also to secure access to them, which sounds obvious, but which was not at the beginning of the investment cycle. Interestingly, partnerships make possible to palliate possible lack of administrative capacities. Local, regional public authorities might not have the necessary skills to choose between the proper technologies and may not have the necessary skills to supervise the implementation of technologies. That said, the case studies show that the process of establishing and implementing a smooth partnerships between stakeholders that is capable of delivering results is long and difficult and not at all automatic. That was a lesson from the Lithuanian case studies that showed that it should be genuinely piloted from within. It should somehow happen spontaneously, even if the policy setting might adopt relevant instruments or approaches that might help develop such a partnership. But in no case it can be imposed through ready-made solutions from outside. So in this respect, the specific approaches and instruments that are available through the cohesion policy setting can help. That was the case of the integrated territorial investment that we described you a little earlier. They were indeed mobilized in the French case. And it helped develop an integrated urban approach within which the project we studied was located. But most importantly, in this respect, the smart specialization strategy approach plays a very relevant role. As a matter of fact, they offer an opportunity to fulfill the two conditions of success that we identified. In other words, they are smart specialization strategies, a privileged place where to adopt a strategic approach and where to engage and promote partnerships. So the entrepreneurial development process that we described allows the identifications of priorities that often have an ICT dimension, and it is documented that about half of the EU regions have adopted ICT-related priorities through their smart specialization strategies. There are also risks to consider. Namely to be a little bit too inward looking through smart specialization strategies and to forget about the rest of the world. There are also through partnerships promoted by smart specialization strategies, there are risks of capture by vested interests. Overall, here is for you some takeaway message from our presentation. We argue that there are indeed theoretical benefits from a multi-level and regionalized approach to digitalization. And there are a number of concrete evidence that cohesion policy approaches and instruments help to reap these benefits. Interestingly, we saw that there is a learning process at work in which the policy setting of cohesion policy, including its regulatory provisions, improve from one programming period to another. Of specific interest for the purpose of this conference, the empirical evidence that we collected suggests that the key contribution of cohesion policy is its ability to foster partnerships at local level. Administrative capacity and strategic plannings are also the other critical success factors of a successful process of digitalization at regional level. Finally, the fact that administrative capacity is an important factor of success suggests that less developed regions with lower capacity are at risk of being left further behind, and this suggests that specific support is needed to mitigate this risk. I thank you very much for your attention, and together with we are ready to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Julie and Louis, for your very interesting presentation. Before passing the floor to the other participants in this keynote address, I'd like to highlight a couple of messages that you have shared with us. The first one is that it is really important to take in consideration local contexts and conditions when we address that's okay. That the importance to take in consideration local contexts and conditions when we speak about cohesion policy. We did this project, the CENTER project, as I told you before, is addressing the special territory of the Central region of Portugal. Central region is a NUTS 2 region, and one lesson that we learned is that even in a relatively small region that is the Central region, when you go down to the local context, to the NUTS 3 or even NUTS 4 level, you find very different contexts, very different needs, requirements, and sometimes it's very difficult to understand what is the common line, the transversal approach we should have when we talk about innovation strategies, and when we talk about the role of digital media, for instance, digital technologies to foster that kind of innovation. Another idea that I would like to highlight is the need to bridge top-down and bottom-up initiatives. Okay, I think that is also a very, very important lesson or idea. We have in our project, we also have both approaches, and as far as the development of some digital solutions to foster digital innovation, territorial innovation, we have addressed a bottom-up approach, and it was very, very interesting to have that experience with people and have the real feeling about their specific needs that sometimes are very different from what you would expect them to be. Okay. Another idea that I also would like to highlight, that it seems to me that is very, very important, is the relevance of partnerships. Okay, in such a diverse context that you can find in territories such as the Central region of Portugal, being able to develop, to establish relevant partnerships with the local communities, but also with the governmental bodies, is a major factor of success in whatever initiatives you may have. So thank you for sharing your views about this topic. I fully subscribe your ideas and your takeaway messages, as Julie pointed out. And now I would like to accept some questions or comments from the other participants. Who wants to take the lead? Oh, everybody is very tired. The conference is already in the final day. So most of you are really tired. And Luis Pedro is one of the researchers that has been very involved in our research activities. Luis, are you with us, Luis?
Yes,
Luis?
I am.
Okay.
I don't have a particular question, but I am.
But some comment would be useful.
Okay. Just sorry, I'm seeing in the chat that someone does want to ask a question.
Okay.
Maybe.
But anyway, if you have a comment, please share it with us.
Yes.
It was me. Can I ask a question?
Jean Almeida. Yes, of course.
So I have a question because I'm very interested in this local context and to look to the local context and not only the regional context. What do you think that are the main challenges in researching and in having projects with local context? I'm starting to do some research about entrepreneurship and innovation at the local level, and I see that one of the biggest challenges is the lack of data at local level. So what are your suggestions to try to not to improve the number of data, but to go another way? I don't know. What are your suggestions for that?
So basically, the question is more the methodological side, from what I understand. My view is that it would depend on your particular research question and angle, and on which kind of exact apparatus for research you can design from that. So I would start, the main point would be to start from the research question and then to go towards the method and the data, and not try to start from the data and going to the research question, basically. And for the specificities and difficulties of dealing with research at the local level, I think that there are some elements that are still present in every cases that are important to keep in mind. A particular one is the risk, especially when you deal with interviews, to be stuck in with the view of some particular stakeholders, which are always interacting together and give you quite a biased understanding of what's going on. So I think crossing the different aspects is very relevant, especially at the local level. Other than that, I do not have a generic and general answer, but maybe Julie can add something on that aspect.
Oh, I liked your point about starting with the research question before putting ahead the data. Now, indeed, statistical data at local NUTS, even NUTS 2 is not always easy, but let alone NUTS 3 or 4, of course. In this respect, of course, you have case studies or other qualitative methods like interviews, but don't forget perhaps also the new, even it's a little bit of a hype, but the new methods around, artificial intelligence database of firms. Again, it depends very much on your research questions, but you can possibly tap into a different database of companies, for example, or the text mining of documents you might find.
Thank you.
Maybe I can ask also a question, if there's time to it. We can't hear you, Professor Ramos.
Yes, I was saying yes, go ahead, but my mic was mute.
I would like to ask you about this whole 5G commotion that's been going on, and what is the position of the digital agenda towards this new technology, its potential effects, and it's quite well known that it's regarded as something very transformative. And if and when we do have 5G infrastructure in place, what are the possible outcomes in terms of the change of the digital agenda itself?
I don't know, Louis, if you have specific insight on this, but I can share with you actually a question that I was myself asking, because it is, for the moment, for what I know, absent from the digital agenda discourse. We hear about all the potential that digitalization can unleash, on the one hand. On the other hand, we have a discourse about Huawei, but that's an issue of industrial policy. We don't want them, all these arguments, but there's no connection between the two. It is as though, but maybe I'm not well informed. And again, it was really very much a question I was asking to myself. So I think it would be interesting to go a little bit deeper and try and get answers to this question.
Yeah. Thank you for your answer, but it was exactly that. Why is it absent of this digital agenda 2030?
I don't know if you, Louis, maybe is more updated than
to the extent of my knowledge as well. The 5G is also not explicitly present in digital agenda so far, at least in the strategic documents. Of course, there are many initiatives. There is, I think, a dedicated high-level expert working group on 5G at the Commission, these kind of initiatives. Whether they will be able to link them in a specific strategy, I don't know yet. I think it's, again, I'm not particularly expert in the specific topic, but my understanding is that it may be linked to social issues around 5G that may make it difficult to highlight it as a broad political objectives. But again, to be confirmed.
One possible answer for that is that 5G is under heavy, very, very, very heavy international strategic war. So maybe no one wants to tackle that, and I don't know. Maybe there is a big question mark around the future, the near future of 5G, and so I don't know. We still do not have 4G in many regions. Okay, so And even sometimes the 3G coverage is so bad.
That's precisely the point. It can be so transformative, so disruptive when we are talking about bottom-up approaches and least favored regions in terms of access and participation and initiatives. And it could be very interesting to have some, I wouldn't say predictive, but some studies that could point to the horizons and maybe spear some ideas in terms of research, but also in terms of what we want to do in the field with this technology.
Okay, it's a topic we are going to follow in the next months and years. Okay, so I'm afraid that we have already passed our limit of time. So I want to give a very, very warm thank to Julie and Luis for the very interesting keynote address that shared with us. Thank you very much. It was very, very nice to have you with us. I hope that we can stay in contact and maybe do some work together in the near future. And I also would like to thank all the participants, not many, but I'm sure very interested. And in a couple of minutes, I would say in 8 or 9 minutes, we will start the next keynote address. So enjoy your time. Have a nice afternoon. Okay. And see you later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Luis.
Bye.